So I have just finished reading a book called The People's Republic of Walmart, which is written by a couple of guys in America, Leigh Phillips and Michal Rozworski. One of them is a sort of contrarian economist, and the other is a journalist. How about that for a match-up, Steve?
That combination would never work. They'd never hit it off.
Anyway, it's an interesting read. Actually, when I say read, I've been doing quite a bit of walking lately, and I've been listening on Audible. So, because I do have the problem as you get older, when you start to read a book, you find yourself drifting off to sleep, particularly if it's an economics textbook. So I found, well, you can't fall asleep while you're walking. Obviously, it would be a danger to traffic if you did. So I've been doing a lot of walking around, listening to books, which actually is quite a good way of consuming all this sort of stuff. But anyway, fundamental question. I thought it was an interesting book. And I'll come to the details of it as we go through this discussion over the next half hour. But the fundamental question, Steve, which is right? Market-based allocation or central planning? Obviously, the answer is a bit of both, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is the beauty of. I mean, I know works. I haven't read that particular book, but I know works of that nature, because when you look at how corporations actually function, they're command hierarchies inside a market.
Yeah,
that's what they are.
Yeah, and he makes the point on that. I mean, he's talking about Walmart, which, if it was a country, if you look at its GDP, it would be the 25th biggest country in the world, just behind Sweden, and obviously it's all centrally planned.
Exactly. And this is the, I mean, neoclassicals who have this orientation, everything's better if you're buying and selling stuff, when that's been implemented inside a company. So you have the marketing division selling its wares to somebody else, et cetera. You get fights over the budget internally. You get people not delivering. You get rivalry where you want cooperation.
Yeah.
And as overbearing as some hierarchies can be, it's everybody cooperating towards a common goal.
Yeah.
And
Sears is the great example of that. So while Walmart was growing, Sears under Eddie Lambert was, and it's covered in this book, was 30 different divisions that were all competing. So first of all, the products were competing for shelf space. So they're competing against each other to get in front of the customer. But then also, and I've seen this in companies as well, where you have to you allocate your budget to buy stuff internally within the business. So everything is run as a profit center rather than a cost center. But they're never particularly effective. And you do go, well, okay, IT is so crap. Why would I be paying for this? I might just get someone from outside. Normally it's, no, you can't do that. You've still got to use our internal resources. It's just and so it almost breeds inefficiency in a way, even though it's supposedly a market-based system.
Well, and again, there's so many mythologies about how markets actually operate, which are based on neoclassical fantasies that have got nothing to do with the real world. But once your mind is set in that fantasy, in what Schumpeter brilliantly called the Ricardian vice, you make a set of assumptions which leads, the only thing you can reach is the conclusion you want to force the listener into. But if they fall through initial presumptions, then they think, that makes logical sense. But you said you start from an absurd starting point. So one of the absurd starting points of neoclassical theory is that everybody knows everything about every product on the market.
Yeah.
And they're all homogenous.
Perfect.
So in that case, all you need to know is what's the market price, and that's all. And everybody already knows that anyway. So all of this knowledge, there's no need for marketing. Now, I'm learning the hard way, having developed a product which I want to make into a commercial success, which is Ravel, how bloody hard it is to market. Okay? You have to get people's attention. People do not know all the products. They do not know the prices. They have no idea of features. And you're trying to shout into that to be heard. Well, if you do that, and if you replicate, if you take something which is a command type structure and then try to make it function in a market type way, you add on all those marketing costs. So I've seen that with the universities. So, when I began as a student at a university, according to Warren Hogan, who was the professor of economics that I fought like crazy in my undergraduate days, we became friends later on. He said that when it came to allocating the budget for economics at the university, he'd have lunch with the vice chancellor. They'd work out a sum, and that'd be the end of it. And there was no need to market Sydney University economics, because that's what you got. It was just told in one place. It was called Sydney, I think, at the time.
Mm.
And then when they decided to market and compete for students and all this sort of stuff, they got marketing divisions everywhere. They're postering stuff on bloody train lines. The costs are huge.
Yeah,
Now
yeah.
that's left out of the neoclassical theory. So if you try to replicate it internally inside a company, your marketing division trying to persuade you to use them rather than go to the rival companies if they allowed you, it's just nonsense. There's
Well,
so
I mean,
many extra costs.
that is the problem, is it? Because marketing is never actually factored in any economic theory, because, as
No.
you say, all products are the same. So if you make a jumper, it's a jumper. Well, if somebody wants a jumper, the jumper costs $30. There we go. You come along and say, well, actually, I've got a $50 jumper. It's just because it looks cool. Economics can't cope with that. Why would people pay $50 for something that's
it's
30?
nonsense. You can cope with. You can build an economic theory that does take into account diversified products and the need for marketing and so on. And I know that can be done because I've bloody well done it.
But you wouldn't want to bring it into a business.
No,
and
itself.
start to use that marketing resource for one department to sell to another department. That is just plain crazy.
It's crazy. So you reduce your costs, and you've all got a set objective. And the thing which I'm actually in Budapest right now for personal reasons, and this puts me in the home of Janos
Medical
Kornai.
reasons, just in case anyone's drawing a
medical. I've got to stuff back. Yeah, nothing. This ain't fun. Okay. But anyway, Janos Kornai is I think probably one of the most important and underrated economists ever, because he posed himself the problem from the opposite point of view: is why does a command economy on its own not work? And what it came down to, I think, was a brilliant way of understanding why corporations behave as command structures inside a market and work effectively. And that is that the pressure that a market puts on a range of companies who are all competing to take a slice of that market is that they're demand constrained. So that if whereas you said a socialist system where there's just one maker of cars or one producer of everything, whether that's got one factory or dozens of factories, there's no pressure to diversify. In fact, the pressure is to minimise your costs because if you have a socialist economy, then all socialist economies began as underdeveloped in one sense or another, whether Russia, which is the original one, China after the rape of the country by the colonial powers in the 19th century. They're building themselves up from everything is being destroyed. You've got to build everything. Therefore, everything deserves money. And even if you don't have a Stalin getting in the way, and Kornai deliberately left out the authoritarian, horrible authoritarian side of actual socialism. He said even if you had an ideal one where they're all trying to give the workers as much money as possible because it's all about the workers, their wages are high. Okay, every industry needs to be developed, so you've got to allocate whatever resources you have very thinly. Nobody quite gets everything they need as their budget, so everybody's resource constrained. And if you're resource constrained, the easiest thing to do is to meet your quota is to make last year's model. And I have my personal example of that. I'm sure I've bored you silly with this one already, but it's when my then girlfriend's brother bought himself a 650cc Russian motorbike for $650 in 1975, I think that was, and so 50 years ago. Opened up the crate and there was a 1942 BMW. So you don't get innovation when you have a totally centrally planned system. But when you embed that, and so you have organisations that behave centrally planned inside a market economy, they're all facing demand constraints. So the way that they can take market share away from their rivals is to innovate.
Yeah.
And so that
would be the exact, the Sears versus the Walmart example. Because Sears didn't innovate. They were so focused on following this free market principle. They were all busy competing against each other.
Yeah.
And they were fighting for shelf space and the like, that they missed a few fundamental things. Like, for example, while they were busy doing that, the whole world was moving to online shopping, and they didn't see that come. They didn't renovate their stores to make them look fresh and modern because they were too busy competing on cost. Whereas Walmart, with their central planned approach, actually was able to be innovative. And so they continued to grow. So there's an example of actually the opposite of what you might expect, the free market in that case. But I take your point about the demand led, because ultimately Walmart will only sell so much. They'll try and sell more, but everything they're doing is in meeting what you'd call share of wallet in marketing speak. How much can you get from the customer? Therefore, let's plan to deliver that based on what we think they're going to need. This is where they sort of like use things like input-output tables, isn't it? Where you go, okay, if we're going to output product X, what do we need for that? What do we need to buy in? When do we need it? Let's hedge the cost of that so that we're not sort of like, putting demand sort of supply constraints, which are going to push the price up. That's all the good stuff of central planning. But the ultimate end game is, how do we get more money out of our consumer?
And that's where the demand side comes in. So you get this yin and yang between the market and this markets in which centrally planned companies compete for market share.
Yeah.
That's what and then the process actually causes the market to grow, because every firm is trying to take market share away from its rivals. Therefore, the total planned investment, and this obviously varies when you've got booms and slumps, obviously, but just a starting point. There's going to be more a desire to invest than there is actual capacity to sell what you're investing, because everybody wants to increase their market share. So if you added up the target market shares for every company in a particular industry, it would exceed the size of the market. Okay, and therefore you get overinvestment in that sense. But that overinvestment means that the ones that succeed are going to be the ones that bring up innovations that more well meet whatever consumer demand is, or shape consumer demand. Consumers did not demand transistors. Okay, it was somebody realizing there was a market for small radios, and if you can make a small device that does the energy switching that's necessary, and the amplification and so on, then you can take market away from the big ones. So it's a combination of the internal central planning and external market, and that gives you a more effective system than pure market or pure central planning. And then you can see the government sitting on top of that, because there are things which the market system is never going to find immediately profitable. There are potential ways in which technology can develop so over time what is not profitable for firms because just too large an investment or too long to wait for a return, and therefore your monetary costs compound, which mean you can't compete with somebody who doesn't have to pay monetary costs, which is the government situation. So you get you blend. So you sort of, I think the best arrangement is firms behaving centrally planned, the market in the middle putting pressure on those firms to compete and innovate, and a government providing the envelope of infrastructure that none of those corporations can individually supply for all the other corporations without, again, charging large amounts of money. So you have a sort of it's let's call it the market, the central planning hamburger. It's government central planning, markets the meat, and then the bread beneath that is the centrally planned firms.
Yeah, and I think some of the tech companies, I mean, Elon Musk might have tried this whole approach of internal market pricing and thrown it away.
I think he's very different on that front. Microsoft did that.
Yeah, Microsoft, that's right.
Yeah.
So I think they threw it away, didn't they? Although they are still a bit of a dog-eat-dog organization.
It caused one of the greatest disasters ever, Windows 8. Because they had apparently, and again, I'm not an expert on Microsoft.
Windows 8, that's how old he is, ladies and gentlemen. Windows 8. I said, that's how old you are, Windows 8.
Mate, I use Windows 3.1. I use Windows 1. Okay, I don't think I'll be back in my software days. I think I saw Windows 2. I think
so. Windows 8 was the one that was never really talked about. So we went from 7 to 10 in most people's. I mean, Windows 8 was so bad they thought, look, we won't even have 9 because it's too close to 8.
Well, the funny thing is, I mean, let's just bring up what it was based on. It was, they thought this was the real cool thing. So let's have Windows running exactly the same way that you have with the phones. And they didn't see that one of the problems might be that one ends up with rather too many apps. Where the fuck is the application I want to run? That's time for a bleep, by the way.
You can organize those into folders. You can organize them into folders.
You can, but it was a pain in the butt in Windows 8. And so what apparently...
And then on top of that, Microsoft mobile phone, which was a disaster too.
Yeah, yeah. So, but the idea was that internal teams competing against each other to
Mm.
be the ones who came up with the new innovations. And what
Yeah.
that meant, of course, was the teams would not share ideas. They'd guard stuff from each other. So
Yeah.
you would have what's being done in one part, which could be useful elsewhere in the organisation, not being shared because that would undermine the competitive pressure that the internal Microsoft market put. And
Mm.
disaster. Okay?
Yeah.
But from what I can tell from I'm not going to hold my breath on Musk anymore after his Trump escapades. But from what I can tell of the way that SpaceX and Tesla are run, uh, they they're cooperative. They're trying to bring everything internal and bring everything inside the organisation. And I believe they apply in a very, it's cooperative, even in the sense that if you're in a meeting you don't want to be part of, you walk out because you know you're not contributing.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that if you had the so-called market pressure. I mean, oh, you've got to go to that meeting, go to this meeting, and I've got to be seen, etc., etc. So a cooperative internal structure is more effective than a competitive
Yeah,
one.
and we've talked about it on this podcast before. When you involve the workers in that as well, so like the whole union structure within Japan, which was unions per company rather than by industry. So unions were actually there working to try and develop efficiencies within the company. That's where you got the innovation. So all of that makes a great deal of sense. When we come back, though, let's have a look at where there's not a profit motive ultimately, which is services like health, for example, like the NHS. So there's an example. Does it need to be more centrally planned? Because it's a bit of a hodgepodge at the moment. And is that part of the problem with the NHS? There's just too many private suppliers competing in something that should be more centrally planned. So we'll look at that when we come back on the Debunking Economics podcast. So, Steve, in part one, just some figures just to finish off where we were talking about Walmart versus Sears and how Walmart had gone down this centrally planned approach, which is covered in this book, The People's Republic of Walmart, which is quite a good read or a good listen if you're walking around. The Sears example under Eddie Lambert, well, it went from Sears had a revenue of 55 billion in 2004. By 2018, that was down to 17 billion.
Oh, Jesus.
Its valuation went from 11 billion to 1.6 billion. So there we are.
This reminds one of my favorite jokes. How do you start a small company?
Start with a big one.
Give it a second or third generation daughter of capitalists, a big one. That was originally applied to the Fairfax. You remember that in Australia?
Yeah.
How do you start a small company and give somebody from the Fairfax family a big one?
Yeah, or give it to Donald Trump would be the other example, wouldn't it? So what about where there's not a profit motive? So the NHS supposedly, it's there. And it is all a question about what's the end game, isn't it? What are you actually there to deliver? You're not there to deliver a profit. You are there to provide a healthier population. Now, you might say, well, the reason for that is so more people can work, so we can increase our GDP, for example, if you're completely heartless. Or you might just say, well, no, we want people to be healthier and happier. So let's make that the end metric. But the NHS is a bit of a hodgepodge, isn't it? Because there's so many, right from from GPs that are not employed by the NHS. They run their own practices. They get paid a set amount per patient. And already I can see, well, if you're playing the system, you go, well, let's get lots of patients that we don't see very often. And then they get bonuses for things like managing people's heart rate, for example, people's blood pressure, which explains why my GP is constantly festering me about it. Obviously, he's getting some sort of reward for that. But that's a good thing because it is, forcing me to address that issue. But in an ideal world, wouldn't the NHS all just be employing people directly and having this central planning that we've seen with Walmart?
I've actually seen there's an idea that a doctor friend of mine, the father of my first major girlfriend, was site medical officer at the Australian Atomic Energy Commission, and he'd been site medical officer for the Snowy Mountain scheme as well. And Arthur used to say that he had heard of, I don't know, I never followed it up on it, but apparently there was at some time in China, not necessarily now, may have been in the feudal times, the way that health was paid for was that you paid the doctor out of it. You paid a fraction of your income to the local doctor, so long as you were well. And as soon as you got sick, you stopped paying. And the only way he can get you back to paying him is to get you well again. So in an intriguing way, yeah, it's say you pay a certain fraction of your income towards the doctor, and that's fine while you're healthy. When you get ill, you stop paying.
Yeah,
so
but then that would be the incentive not to keep yourself healthy, wouldn't it? You'd go, I could go to the gym and make myself healthy, or I could just let myself go and then I'm not going to pay my health care
I'm
costs.
sure the Chinese had a system for malingerers, okay? But the general principle of people who wish to remain healthy is that you pay this as effectively an insurance system. Yeah? And that's what health really should be, but it's insurance paid at the national level, because again, for a country, you're best off if everybody is as healthy as they can be. And that was the original objective of the NHS, that we all benefit from other people's health. And this has been lost in the whole marketing. It's all about me, and I couldn't care about your health. And gee, I just got a cold. I wonder it's because you were sneezing.
When I was in Australia for about 20 years, I had the same doctor, and he knew me very well, inside and out. He'd been places no man had ever been before, and I saw him once. Actually, I had to see him because I was hit by a truck many years ago, and it made me epileptic.
That explains it.
A great deal.
At last I know why. Okay, yeah.
It was a GPO post office truck at Waterloo Station. I used to drive over the concourse at Waterloo Station. I was running for a train, which happens at railway stations, and I collided with a GPO truck that had.
This is in your car or just your?
No,
your body?
I was on foot, and it was, it was driving across the concourse. It was driving past a parked GP. I should have sued the hell out of them, but we didn't do that in those days in the UK, because he was driving past a parked truck on a busy concourse. The truck shouldn't have been parked there. I didn't see it. He didn't see me. It hit me.
And suddenly you're a pedestrian accident.
And it scarred my brain tissue, and it made me epileptic for a while. Got over that problem, but I was on Dilantin for years and years. I've forgotten where I'm going on this. I do know that, anyway, I was forced, my doctor, John Bafsky in Sydney, for 20 years. I had to see him every year because I had to get a certificate for my driving license. But he said, well, we may as well give you the full check. So he did everything, the blood test, my heart monitor. He'd check everything and then say, okay, well, this is a bit bad. You might need to lose a bit of weight, or we'll put you on these tablets or whatever. But we tried everything to keep me off tablets because I was still a relatively young man at that stage. But he did everything under one roof, and he just did it all, and that seemed to work well. When I came here to the UK, and I said to my doctor, well, I used to have this checkup once a year. He was going, oh, okay, well, and he put me off to see various specialists. So I went to somebody, for God's sake, just to take my blood pressure. I mean, now I do it myself at home, but I had an appointment for somebody to go and do that. I had someone else who took my blood sample and somebody else who took a urine sample. It was all just all over the place. All of these specialists involved that John Bafsky used to do in just this one room, once a year.
So there's general practice.
Yeah, but how did it get so wrong that it's been being done by so many people?
And that's bringing the market concept inside what should be otherwise a centrally planned system.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And then all of those services, they'll go out and say, okay, well, we're going to use this this company for sampling your blood, for example. Why did they choose that company versus another one? So this is where we get back to marketing, isn't it? There will be a marketing cost involved in all of that for somebody trying to grab that bit of service, which is just a waste of time when the end game is not who, but, what is
the question of... It's where you get your innovations from, where you want that market pressure to bring about innovations. Whereas other sides, where you want to deliver, given the technology that exists at the moment, deliver that as effectively as possible. So that is why we have to get away from what neoclassicals have pushed us into. This, always and everywhere, the best possible arrangement is a market. And so we say that the market behaves completely different to the neoclassical theory to start with. That once you acknowledge how it behaves, then you get points where the market is extremely valuable, which is the type of pressure that Kornai found absent in Hungarian socialism. And that's one reason that Hungary and Yugoslavia both tried to innovate, have some form of market socialism at one point. And Kornai was part of why they tried that. the whole thing fell apart before anything could be effective. But there were some successful companies that came out of that. I
What
think
do
it
you
was a
mean by
company called
market
Inglis.
socialism?
Well, the idea was you have the overall political system is socialist, and in that sense, we can see China being an example of that. But
Yeah.
individual firms are encouraged to exist and compete with each other to make various products. So rather than having, like for example, and I've done a lot of interesting research in my personal life, and one involved a Romanian girlfriend who managed to buy a TV 10 years before most of her neighbours because she went on a delegation to America and bought one over there and brought it back in her luggage. But otherwise, what you had was with the completely socialist attempt. There's only one company making TVs. It doesn't have enough suppliers coming in. Everybody is being paid large amounts of money they can't spend. So the classic socialist joke was they pretend to pay us and we pretend to work. There's nothing like a major supply of goods in existence in the shop. So you have to queue, and you queue either literally or metaphorically. So the queue to get a TV was 10 years long. Okay. Now, all this is the complete failure of a completely centralized system where you're trying to grow every part of it simultaneously, and therefore you get resource constraints, which is, again, quantized. Whereas when you have the market, what they do with the market system, rather than one supplier of televisions and one supplier of refrigerators and so on, they allowed companies to compete. They encouraged the workers to form, to some extent, worker cooperatives where they benefited. If they got more of the revenue, they could share that. And a range of companies. I think one was called Inglis, which suddenly you started getting Inglis refrigerators turning up as competition for Westinghouse and GM and so on, both America and Australia. So they were still overall socialist political system. There were attempts to keep wages more uniform within the company, but there were more than one producer, so there was no longer a guarantee that your fridge would be sold because that was only one fridge. You had to be able to outcompete the others, and so that was successful for a while, and it's an argument behind why China's been successful as well, that they have the similar sort of thing. It's overall, socialism is the ideology. They obviously have central planning at the national level, but they encourage as many companies, or not as many, but lots of companies to form, often regionally based. So different provinces and different cities will have their champion in a particular industry, and then they're all competing in a huge marketplace, and devil take the hindmost, and you get enormous innovation out of that.
Well, I guess the fundamental issue, isn't it, is whether you want an economy which delivers based on wants versus an economy that delivers based on needs. So if there's people who need stuff and they can't have it because there's wealthy people who are pursuing their wants, that is a good argument for socialism, isn't it? To say, well, actually, you can't have what you want if we haven't already taken care of what these people need.
Mm. And therefore you have a combination of segments of the economy, some of which you provide as close as possible to free, which is the idea of national health. But others, if you want that sports car, you've got to earn the money for that sports car. So you have in other words, it's not just one size fits all. And that's one I mentioned yin and yang earlier. I think Eastern philosophy has a better idea of needing a balance between opposing forces, whereas the tendency in the West is always to think there's one extreme or the other extreme. So, it's pro-market and pro-state, et cetera, to realize there's better off in the middle is more something which is built into Asian philosophy than Western.
But getting back to Walmart and then applying that to health. So if we are concerned that the NHS is perhaps too internally market orientated.
So since the deforms, let's get the word right, since the deforms of the Thatcher era. Yeah,
exactly. Well, I don't know as it was. I mean, but actually, it started out, like a lot of these systems as well. It's a bit like, the Soviet era, socialism in the Soviet era. It didn't work terribly well. Well, because Stalin wasn't a terribly nice guy, but also, a lot of it was implemented in a fairly ad hoc fashion. It's something that's covered in this book. But also, I mean, the NHS started in a similar way. It wasn't sort of like, what's the best system? It's like, well, okay, we've got a bunch of GP practices. Let's keep them going. Let's give them some sort of support. It wasn't necessarily starting with a blank sheet of paper and saying, what is the best way forward? Whereas, and look, listeners or viewers in America be interested in your take on this, but I interviewed someone years back about the success of Kaiser Permanente as a private health insurer who does employ a lot of people directly. So they try and put GPs employed directly by Kaiser Permanente, with nurses employed by Kaiser Permanente, with specialists employed, all under the one roof. And the whole idea behind all of that is processes are a lot simpler if everyone's in the same place, that you don't need to go through laborious, rechecking of people. First thing you do when you go and see a specialist is they go through your medical history that you've already been through so many times with your GP. The GP can call the specialist and say, "Oh, this guy's got a high heart rate, a high blood pressure. Sorry, we've given him the tablets, but it's still not working. What else do we need?" So that conversation happens, and everyone works towards a solution. The incentive for Kaiser Permanente with all of that, obviously, is that they want to deliver a good service so that people subscribe to it and they get a good reputation. I'm not sure whether they do or not, but the other incentive would be to drive down costs.
Yep.
And that would be a better allocation of resources under that. So it's that central planning that we saw happening with Walmart being applied in a health setting. There's no reason, so they're doing it for a profit motive. There's no reason why the NHS couldn't be doing it not for a profit motive, but for a cost reduction or better delivery of service motive.
Yeah. And you then end up paying more towards the wages and have less in terms of the marketing and extraneous costs, where you do the same thing 4 or 5 or 6 times, as you say, because you're not sharing information because you're a market system. It's taking that out of the way. But it's a question of just how far does that scale, and it does not scale to the size of the national economy. So you want to have your competitive units, you want them to be embedded in a market, but internally they'll be more successful if they don't try to replicate the market in their internal structures.
How do you split it up though? Do you do it geographically? Do you say, well, I'm going to move to Norfolk because the health service is better there, for example?
Or as a consumer, you may have those sorts of dilemmas forced your way. But like you're talking about a company like Walmart competes across the whole United States. So there'll be a Walmart shop wherever you go. Their market is to get in there and destroy Sears, which of course they've successfully done. Amazon, the same story. I mean, the reason it's so successful is that it's reduced the costs of even search costs. And this is one thing. I remember seeing Clive James doing a lovely little piece about choice in America, and he walks inside a hamburger joint, and there's about 30 different things you have to say whether you do or don't want. Do you want fries with that? Et cetera, et cetera. And you work out the mathematical number of combinations. It's occasionally approaches the number of atoms in the known universe. I said, "Oh, for God's sake, give me a hamburger." It's choice itself can be a frustrating experience. Whereas the vision that the neoclassicals have about the consumer is that your preferences are innately given. You've got your immaculately conceived indifference curves, and you go into the marketplace with those. It's not the real world, and let's stop modelling a fantasy one and then taking guidelines about how to manage the real world using a set of intellectual fantasies.
Yeah, but you mentioned the planning word there, and that's key to all of this discussion, isn't it? Because I mean, the reason why people say, "Oh, well, let's go with the market-based system," is because we don't need to plan to the same extent, because the market will determine what's needed. So for that hamburger, they know what the demand is, although that hamburger, of course, is centrally planned in its delivery, but let's ignore that for the moment. We know what, people want hamburgers, they're going to pay a certain amount for it. Therefore, we don't need to plan beyond that. Health, I don't know. We start looking at all of those services. You do need to plan. The problem is governments are not very good at planning. And so
the governments have made themselves not very good at planning. I mean, this is, again, one of the frustrations of people reasoning out of the current situation. because I mean, would I want Trump's cabinet to be planning? No effing way. Okay? You got a bunch of people who should be stuck in front of cameras talking in Fox News rather than trying to run, I don't know, things like the CIA. So we've denigrated the standards over time, and there was certainly after World War II there was a strong emphasis amongst the survivors of that battle, amongst the soldiers, and then the public as well. We've got to build a decent life for everybody. And the extent to which the governments were staffed by people who were damn good engineers, who had sensible ideas they wanted to bring about and were capable of executing them effectively. That led to things like in Sydney's case, and in the Great Depression, building the Harbour Bridge. Because an engineer decided we needed a huge structure where the size scale of the bridge was probably 8 to 10 times the necessary size at that time.
Yeah,
he said
not big enough now.
Going to grow. It's too small now. Okay, yeah. But we got 40 years extra out of that. Foresightedness. Nugget Coombs, who was the person who wrote the white paper on employment, the people of the Snowy Mountain scheme, there were intelligent people working for the government because they had believed in the common good.
Yeah,
and that's lost.
But do you know the symbol of how that's changed? So there you had an over-engineered Sydney Harbour Bridge. They needed to build an overflow, so they built a tunnel. How many lanes did that tunnel have? 2. Why not 3 or 4? If you're planning for the future. But anyway, but also, it's like in the UK now, we are close to, it's about 45% of GDP is government spending. We're getting close to, half and half, aren't we, really? And out of all that money, couldn't deliver the HS2. That's just been a planning disaster.
Yeah.
They spend a fortune on an NHS IT system to try and what would seem like a very simple task of giving everybody access to everybody's patient records rather than the fragmented system. How much did they spend on that? 10 billion, and it was never really implemented. 10 billion just chucked down the drain. And then, of course, the post office IT system. Say no more. This ability to deliver on what are quite fundamental pieces of public-owned infrastructure just seems to have been a disaster. So you're right. We can talk about the philosophy of central planning, but governments, it seems, particularly the British government, but I think it's the same around the world, just don't have it.
It's learned incompetence. It's learned incompetence. If you go, the NHS was designed by the government. It worked very effectively in its initial framework. It's the anti-government attitude of the Friedmans and his acolytes that to demolish the capacity of the state to do that type of planning, because you're basically telling people don't work here. And so you get a lower level of incompetence, high level of incompetence. You don't have the same skill level. I'd take a Nugget Coombs over anybody in the Australian public service or any of the ones I've met globally these days. You need a system which attracts people who want to do the planning at the top level, and you want people inside the firm who also know the firm has to plan, and then the market is the ham between the two burgers. That's what you need. And I think the Chinese probably have pulled that off better than anybody, and they've maintained both slices, the top and the bottom slices of the burger are doing very nicely. Thanks very much, and the ham is better than American by a large margin.
All right, so we need governments run less by lawyers and more by logistic experts. It's perhaps the way. If you've got a logistics job, you know all about this stuff. Get yourself into government and try and fix all of these problems. Look, there's a whole nother dimension to this discussion which I wanted to have, which is around just allocation of resources, which is a fundamental question. So maybe we're out of time now, but I do want to look at because that's the argument often given, isn't it? The market-based system allows for a better allocation of resources. So we'll dispel that myth. But let's do that next week. Good to talk as always, Steve.
Mate, bye.